Welcome to a new sci-fi story from Reddit user Jibe Ho. If you want to read more stories from them, please check out their link in the description. Beyond Zeno's Wall. God does not play dice with the universe, as surely as you can map the arcs of the planets in the sky. You can map the percussion of a human life, or even the rise and fall of empires. To assume that because we see time linearly, cause after effect, that time itself is linear, is the height of narcissism. The book of life is written. Everything that will happen has happened and is happening now. Excerpt from Essays on the Human Perception of Time and the Deterministic Faith by Dovius. The devil's own icy wind tore across the Great Mariner salt flats, blowing the flames in Syloh's kerosene stove almost flat and stealing away any heat it might have given her. The wind carried in it little bits of the flats that cut across her face when she lowered her veil for a sip of brackish water from her canteen. Her bike had been under a threadbare tarp since the wind had picked up 3 days ago. She couldn't ride it in these conditions, and she couldn't let the wind strip it bare. Syloh huddled against its tarp-covered frame as a makeshift windbreak. It did a poor job. She looked out over the glaring white landscape, occasional puffs of salt kicked up by the merciless wind.
Just my luck to be stuck out here in this,
she thought, absently turning her camp stove off and then restarting the flickering flame. Flanking her on both sides were the massive towers marking her way, and the haven to which she should have made before the winds came. Each one was almost a kilometer high and spaced out by about 20. The east side of every tower was scoured white by wind and salt, and navigation lights that had once lit the structures were now long dark.
So close. Just another 2-3 clicks, and I'd have had a nice thick wall to hide behind.
It was a testament to whoever had built the towers that the wind had only knocked over a few and had yet to blow away the ruins. Slightly above them in the sky, Syloh could see the ring giant of Kalis, with its tan, almost uniform, swirling clouds of gas and beige rings radiating out from it, only interrupted by the slit, where some of its closer moons had cleared away the ice and dust. Near the planet's pole was a halo of golden light, the ring city of Gomorrah glaring down at her.
Why would you leave?
The winds had died just under a day ago, and Syloh had managed to make it the final few towers down the line. She sat on top of one now. The top of each tower was more or less flat with no guardrail. Ways to the top had been added. Syloh assumed long after the tower's construction. She had left her bike in an atrium at the base of the tower. Though there were others in the tower, no one would touch her bike. You didn't come to the flats unless you wanted to be left alone, and you generally extended the same courtesy to others. The view at the top was incredible. She could see for what felt like thousands of kilometers in any direction. Of course, the view was nothing more than the stark white salt flat stretching off into infinity for 3/4 of the compass. Even from up here, Syloh could see the wind picking up swirling puffs of salt and blowing them downrange. Only the slate-grey mountains to the east broke the uniform landscape. She would have to brake for those after the next windstorm, so she wouldn't get caught up in it. She did not want to relive that experience. Aside from the mountains, only a single back smudge marked this section of the flats as any different from the rest. The carbon-scored hulk of a long-dead ship stuck up out of the ground at an awkward angle. It would have been picked clean for salvage by now. Almost all of the Highland wrecks were. If you wanted to salvage on Mariner, now, you had to go into the lowlands, where the pressures were high enough to turn carbon dioxide from a relatively harmless gas into poison. Still, it was a much more honest life than that of a brat up on Gomorrah. She could have stayed if she wanted to. She didn't have to be here. But of course, she didn't have a choice.
God does not play dice, and all is written.
She had come to the flats, had always come to the flats, and would always come to the flats. The same was true of who she had been in the Ring City.
But if that's true, then why would I leave? Why cross to the flats?
Syloh looked up to the heavens. Kalis and Gomorrah weren't in the sky anymore. Instead, she could see a bright star in the morning sky. Lassity. Not really a star, but another gas giant in the system with its own moons. Syloh wondered if any people on those moons cared what was written for them. Elon sat in the hard vacuum of the launch bay without an EVA suit. After all, when you were a Rachi, you were just a nervous system in an automation. It didn't take much to be vacuum hardened. Certainly not a bulky EVA suit. He still probably had to worry about radiation. But hey, you only live once. Elon was admiring what in his opinion was the last word in ship design. His monocraft, the Jackal. ATC-230 was supposed to be an elegant toy for the rich on Aeneas to fly around in, like a jet ski in the canals off Gomorrah. With its elegantly long chisel-shaped nose and thin straight wings folded up over the cockpit, the aeroframe engineers had had a field day designing it. Of course, Elon had come along and ruined it. He'd stripped the cowling from around the thermo rocket for cooling and easier maintenance. He'd added a mid-air refueling probe to the starboard wing and balanced it out with a spotlight on the port wing. Those were minor crimes though, nothing compared to the monstrosity bolted below the fuselage. The large coil gun was almost half as big and just as long as the main body of the Jackal. It was covered in exposed wires, thermo control units, and heavy power coupling leading back to the RTGs in the main body. It was pretty ugly, but it was practical. And at the end of the day, that's all that counts when you're a freelance pilot. Elon climbed into the cockpit and started his checklist.
RTGs 1 and 2 are go. 3DPS and RCS are go. Orbital nav and local nav computers are showing green. Radios 1 and 2 are green and radar is active.
Elon took an audio cord out of his pocket and plugged himself into the comm system through a port on his thigh. Static crackled in his ears, relieving the oppressive silence of the vacuum.
March Station Control, this is Monocraft Jackal transponder frequency 00832 requesting permission to disembark.
Static crackled over the radio.
Jackal, you are cleared to drop from Bay 3. Godspeed.
A hatch under the Jackal slid open, revealing the barren surface of Mariner. It was all white salt flats, marred, with grey mountains and yellow rivers. Elon felt himself slip into freefall as the clamps released his ship into the void below the station, thrown out by the centrifugal force of a spinning O'Neill cylinder. Syloh had left the salt flats and their towers behind. It took her days of exposed travel, but she did it. Now, she had new problems, namely, large boulders and steep cliff faces. For her small motorbike, it was a lot harder than the flats. The winds were still there, though. They seemed to be an ever-present part of Mariner, icy tinged with salt and relentless. Kalis was back in her sky. Syloh stopped at a yellow mountain stream to refill her canteen and look back on her progress. She was halfway up the side of a barren, slate-grey mountain slope. Its foothills were marbled white and grey from wind-blown salt. An occasional splash of yellow came from the mountain stream, the same stream Syloh was drinking from. It added a sickly colour to the whole scene. If the stream added verity, then the horizon sapped it back out. It was totally flat and white, only broken by the occasional spindly tower as they marched off in their geodesic. It truly was a desolate world. It had taken centuries just to get this pathetic half-poisonous atmosphere on, and it would be centuries more before it was even close to being a garden world. Syloh took another sip of yellowish water.
All right, halfway there. Maybe.
Truth be told, Syloh wasn't entirely sure where she was going, just what she would find when she got there. She kicked a small rock over the cliff.
Dovius, I hope to God above that you were right, because if you're not…
Instead of finishing the thought, Syloh got back on her bike and restarted her climb up the treacherous mountainside, all the way till she saw the first face carvings. That's when Syloh knew she was getting close. Vibrations from the thermo rocket travelled up through the space frame and cockpit seat of the Jackal and finally into Elon's mechanical body, where they were registered as sound in his ears. It felt great to be back flying in his ship, even if the new cannon slung under her belly made it feel sluggish. Said cannon was the whole reason he was out here. He was testing his new toy. Elon started the charge cycle for the capacitors, idly watching his radar and transponder scopes for any ships in the area. All he found was a lumbering gas tanker burning its drive too low in the upper atmosphere, almost directly below him. Its drive was ionizing the air around it, sending off quite the light display. Like an aurora, he thought. But it shouldn't be in any danger for this test. Elon angled his nose so that his shot would burn up quickly in Mariner's atmosphere and pulled the trigger. Almost instantly, he found his ship spinning end over end.
Okay, so the firing angle is a bit lower than the CG,
he thought.
Nothing I can't compensate with a little upstick for now.
He checked his scanners to see if he could pick up the projectile. Instead, he found something much better. A small craft flying fast trying to get out of the atmosphere. Its transponder had it marked as the Wraith, a smuggling ship with quite the bounty on its head. All Elon had to do was swing down and clip a wing, sending it crashing down into the flats. One quick call to the authorities and some time to identify the crash site, and the bounty was his. Elon maneuvered himself down behind the Wraith by about 1 kilometer, coming down behind it so its forward-facing radar couldn't see him. The maneuver put his ship pretty low. He could see a temperature gauge showing his hull heating up from friction with the thin air down here. Elon didn't want to get any closer to the Wraith, for fear of being noticed, and the only weapon he had that could do the job from this distance was his coil gun.
Okay, I can do this. Just fire, and immediately give it as much upstick as I can to level out. Easy.
Elon moved his flight stick back and forth trying to get a positive lock on the Wraith.
Come on, give me some tone.
Finally, his crosshair fell over the distant ship, and he got a whine of a positive lock. He took the shot. Immediately, the Jackal pitched down, and like a kite in the wind caught the atmosphere. Elon watched in horror as his speed plummeted and the temperature gauges started to climb. He'd really done it this time. The wind howled as Syloh rode between two of the larger carved faces and came unstuck in time. Dovius had told her that only places of power could displace you in time. She guessed he was right about at least that. Syloh found herself as a little girl living in an O'Neill cylinder. Even though she had grown up in the rotational gravity, It had always made her sick and messed with her balance. That's why her family had moved to Gomorrah. She had felt wind for the first time there. Syloh came back into the present in time to see a bright purple star in the sky overhead, where Lassity had been, framed by an otherworldly shimmering on the horizon, like the aurora that formed at the poles of some worlds. Just as quickly, she was thrown back into her past. She was meeting Dovias again, on a dance floor of a party being held on a barge in the canals that flowed between the massive skyscrapers of the ring city of Gomorrah. He was explaining the world to her and the limitations of human perception.
God does not play dice with the universe,
he was saying. Like all Api, his skin and hair glowed softly blue in the night.
As surely as you can map the arcs of the planets in the sky, you can map the precision of a human life, or even the rise and fall of empires.
That's impossible,
Syloh said back to him. She was shivering now. A cold wind had picked up, and she was annoyed with this wannabe preacher for interrupting her rememberings.
How could anyone predict the future?
She asked. Dovias was unfazed by her skepticism.
You're right. It is impossible for you or me. But great minds have been made. Minds as vast as entire moons. They can take in all the data of the universe down to the momentum of individual particles, and with this, construct accurate models of the future and past.
Syloh laughed.
Don't tell me you're one of these cultists who worship the aliens that built these rings?
Despite her ridicule, Dovias kept talking to her.
Don't limit yourself with human perceptions,
he implored her.
All time happens at once. We think we can control the universe only because we see cause and effect one after another. But the book of life is already written. What happened in the present and the future is as unchanged as the past.
By the end of the night, Syloh was convinced. It was easier that way. In a world where you didn't have to care, didn't have to worry. After all, why would God play dice? Elon wasn't very fond of dying. He supposed that most people weren't.
But most people weren't streaking through the upper atmosphere of a god-forsaken moon in a god-forsaken corner of the universe about to burn up. Really puts things into perspective, doesn't it?
Still, he wasn't going without a fight. Re-entry sucked, and burning up more so. But there were ways of avoiding it. Chief among them was not getting stuck in an atmosphere in the first place.
Too late for that now,
Elon thought.
What other options do I have?
He could try to nose up and use the belly of his monocraft to brake against the atmosphere, but that would just make him burn up faster. He had air brakes, but they would fly off at these speeds. He was starting to see flames over the nose of his craft, and Elon could feel the temperature of the cockpit rising. He had to think fast.
No. Screw thinking. I need to act fast.
Elon pulled the flight stick back into his gut as far as it would go, and threw the throttle on his thermo-rocket against the firewall. The result was the Jackal doing another somersault, this time coming to a stop, with his tail facing the direction of movement, engine at full burn. Though the superheated rocket exhaust was being blown back over the body of his Momocraft, it was a lot cooler than the plasma that it was forming a buffer against, and the exhaust was also slowing him down. Elon said a silent prayer to Newton, Tsiolkovsky, and any other sainted physicist he could think of. The fuselage shook with the forces of re-entry as he shot through the sky almost 20 times as fast as a sound wave. After an eternity of 15 minutes, all of which Elon spent crushed by the force of acceleration into his chair, his mechanical body weighing many times its usual amount, the nightmare ended. His monocraft, the stable flying machine that it was, flipped itself over nose first. Elon relaxed for the first time since firing his coil gun.
It really is strange what you notice after a life and death experience,
Elon thought.
like lassity, had it always glowed that bright in the sky? And purple.
But he wasn't out of it yet. He still had to land in a half-melted scorch aircraft. Unfortunately, he had come down over the Kronos Mountains, and the only place for kilometers in any direction that looked suitable for an emergency landing was a valley between two mountains. It had a worrying red light emanating from it. Elon shrugged.
Beggars can't be choosers.
The devil's own icy wind blew up through the valley. Even this far from the flats, it carried a tinge of dry salt with it. Syloh stopped at the base of the valley, head swimming with her past. She was on a dirty, cramped transport, heading for Mariner, the furthest out of Kalus's moons, to see if Dovias had an inkling of truth in him. All she could afford was a one-way ticket. Or was she wasting her life away at parties in Gomorrah, resting assured that she had no choice in the matter, as the Book of Life had been written long before humanity had stumbled into the system? No, she was at her sister's funeral, holding back tears with the thought that Lily was still alive in the past, and that this was all as temporary as those moments of life now seemed. Or had she met Dovias after the funeral? Syloh stood in front of the great mind that Dovias had talked of, or at least its manifestation. It called out to her in the language of thought. Its mind was much vaster than she could even start to comprehend. Dovias was wrong. Mind only started to describe it. Demon was much closer to the truth. Despite the difference in computing power, the demon still showed her everything. Time meant nothing to the demon. It could see into the future and the past. She did her best to understand it. She saw a civilization wiped out, its destruction long known to it. But why fight what was already written? She saw her own life in its fullest, from growing up on Gomorrah to arriving in the valley.
What about the O'Neill cylinder?
Syloh saw the greatest thinkers of a civilization coming together to make an array of sensors that could see and calculate the momentums of every individual particle in the system, and do the same for every major body in the cosmos. Syloh watched as they made a mind that could comprehend and compute all of this data. She saw humanity, millions of Tali, Rachi, and Api, hurling themselves between stars on small fusion-powered generation ships. She watched as the ships were built with Api drives and Rachi analog computers, and with the Tali's will for expansion and exploration. She watched as the demon first saw humanity for the first time, seeing something that it had not predicted. Syloh watched as it spent centuries trying to revise its programming to fit humanity into its model, trying to predict what they would do. Nothing worked. The demon stalled. It tried to let Syloh see through its eyes, to see what it was doing to the system, changing the orbits of planets, throwing asteroids around at nearly the speed of light, fusing atoms in the heart of Lassity, turning it into its own unsustainable star. It was throwing a fit, trying to make sense of the intruders, and it was going to destroy everything and everyone in the process. Revert everything back to a state that it could understand, and Syloh would be amongst the first to go. Coming here had been a mistake. Still, she had to do something, didn't she? If not for her own sake, then for the rest of the system.
Why, though? This is all written, isn't it? Why bother? Why make a fuss?
Syloh threw her mind against the demon in despair. She tried to push it, tried to make it stop. She tried to get it to empathize with her and the rest of the system, get it to see the pain and the suffering, the loss of an entire system in chaos. It nearly broke under the weight of it all. It was enough to get the demon to turn its attention inward to what she was doing. It didn't care. It didn't want to empathize with 500 quadrillion imperfect little minds. Instead, she was overwhelmed by the vastness of its mind. The valley and Syloh's mind filled with red light.
Maybe Dovias was right. This is all pointless.
Suddenly, the attention of the demon was ripped away from her. She followed its gaze to a small comet streaking through the sky. It was a monocraft. The demon hadn't predicted the pilot losing control of his weapon and ship as he tried to shoot down a mark. And now, he was trying to land in the same valley as the demon and Syloh. At least it was obvious to Syloh. This was the only flat land for kilometers, but the demon was still stuck on how it had miscalculated. In a last-ditch effort, Syloh showed the demon his own prediction, that she had lived her whole life in Gomorrah, and she showed something of hers, memories of growing up on the O'Neill cylinder, of Coriolis sickness, and a friend she had on the station, people whose minds the demon realized it could never know, because Syloh was an unaccounted variable. And if it had been wrong about her, how many other previously sound predictions are now worthless? How many other variables had gone unnoticed? Maybe it could have brushed this aside with the rest of its trouble predicting humanity, but it was too soon after the failed prediction of the pilot and after being forced to see the world through Syloh's eyes. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. The demon collapsed under the weight of its world caving in. Syloh was left alone in the valley. The icy winds had finally died.
We don't get a lot of Aenean ships out here.
The old man had said that almost a dozen times now, like a radio transmitter set to loop. Elon tried again.
If you don't have tanks that will fit, do you have adapters that will work?
The old man just looked at him.
We don't get a lot of Aenean ships out here.
Elon sighed and turned to the old man's assistant.
What about the rotivator? Does it take E35 adapters?
The assistant went round the back of Elon's ship and checked its hook. Yeah, this should work. He paused, giving Elon a strangely humorous look. Can I ask why you're down this far, the gravity well, if you can't get back out? Elon almost laughed at that.
I'm asking myself the same question, kid.
Elon paid the assistant to refuel the Jackal and went back into town to find Syloh. It didn't take long. The only town that Elon had enough fuel to fly them to was tiny, just a main street and a few side alleys. He found Syloh in one of these, resting her back against the wall of a whitewashed building. She was staring into the flame of a small kerosene stove. She had been doing that in the valley when he had almost landed on top of her.
There's apparently nowhere in town I can get drop tanks for my ship. So, we're going to have to use the rotivator to get into orbit. After that, we can get to a station. Come on, I've got the ship fueling up now.
Syloh nodded, putting her stove away, and followed him. She had barely said 2 words to him since he found her alone in the valley. As they walked through the town, they passed a gathering of people all watching a preacher. She seemed to be from one of the denominations that worshipped the long-dead alien civilizations that had built so much of the Doa system.
Determinist? Was that what they called themselves?
God does not play dice with the universe,
The preacher was saying.
as surely as you can map the arcs of the planets in the sky, you can map the percussion of a human life, or even the rise and fall of empires.
Syloh turned away from the preacher and muttered under her breath.
God does not play dice with the universe,
She said.
He's left the crapshoots to us.
So that brings us to the end of this latest story from Reddit user Jibe Ho, called Beyond Zeno's Wall. Keep your eyes peeled for more stories from some of Reddit's best sci-fi writers. And I do want to give a big thanks to Jibe Ho for giving me permission to narrate their story. If you want to hear more sci-fi and sci-fi horror stories from Reddit, please let me know in the comments. If you want to help us out, feel free to like our videos, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you're notified of all future content. Thanks again, and I'll catch you all very soon. Cheers.